In most missing person cases, all it takes for the mystery to be solved is the right person coming forward with information, and it cracks the case wide open. Trail cameras spotted David Brown wandering with his shirt torn open and his glasses missing after he disappeared while on a walk in Florida. After extensive searches, David remains missing. David was 69 years old at the time of his disappearance and had recently been diagnosed with cancer. He lived in Georgia with his wife, but had traveled to Hernando County, Florida to visit his brother, Carl. On a previous visit, the brothers had come across a large oak tree on his property. David was moved by the tree, which was described as having branches that reached up to the heavens, and the brothers prayed for David's health there. Now, David wanted to visit the tree and pray there again. The brothers went out in a golf cart on August 13th, taking a dog with them. Not long into the journey, they came across a tree that had fallen on the trail. Carl decided to go back and get tools to clear the tree, but David wanted to go on. He took the dog with him and carried on foot. Around midday, the dog came back alone, which immediately made Carl worry. The search for David began not long after. Checking trail cameras, the search teams found the first clue in David's disappearance. He was spotted wandering south into the woods. The dog was still with him at the time, and it looked as if David was following it, but he was missing his glasses. The glasses and one of David's shoes were found near the trail camera. Another sighting came later that day. David had made it out of the woods and approached a house in the neighborhood of Baton Road in Brooksville. The house had a doorbell camera, which filmed the encounter. David's shirt had been torn open at the back and was hanging loose. He was carrying wildflowers in his arms and told the homeowner that he was lost. He asked for directions to the tree. Canines and ATVs were used in the search for David. It was clear that he left his brother's property, and the search teams found a barbed wire fence they believed he had traveled past. There was hair on the fence, which matched hair of the dog that was with David. It's not clear how the two became separated or when that happened. Searches were extensive. The terrain was difficult to move through, and searchers had to move on their hands and knees at some points. Unfortunately, they turned up no clues as to what happened to David after he left the house and where he was caught on camera. Weeks later, the police received a tip from a man who spotted someone they believed to be David. He'd seen the man the day after David's disappearance on Spring Lake Road. It was about 2.5 miles from Carl's property. The man described David with the same torn shirt that he was seen wearing in the footage. He was disheveled and looked homeless. The man didn't realize he'd seen anything important until coming across an appeal for information on social media. David's family speculated that he may have ended up in a homeless encampment. David never had any problems with memory before, and his brother didn't notice anything out of the ordinary during his stay. But it was possible that he may have had some lapse of memory due to the medication he was taking at the time. It's possible David received help from someone who didn't realize he was a missing person. Anyone with information on this case can contact the Hernando County Sheriff's Office at 352-754-6830.
Jared Adedero. On the 2nd of October 1999 at around 11:30 in the morning, two men came across a very young boy while fishing at a campsite on the Big South Trail, which is a part of the Arapahoe and Roosevelt National Forest in Colorado. And while running into a lone child in the middle of nowhere is cause for concern, the two fishermen saw a group of hikers about 80 to 90 feet ahead. They figured that the child was a part of that group since after a brief conversation, the child ran off toward the group they saw. This child was 3-year-old Jared Adedero, and this was the last time anyone would ever see him again. To understand how a 3-year-old even ended up in that situation, we have to take a step back and examine the life of his father, Alan Adedero. Alan was a divorced, single father who was taking care of his 2 children, the 3-year-old son Jared and a 6-year-old daughter Jocelyn. Earlier that year, Alan had become deeply involved with a local religious organization known as the Christian Singles Network Group. By October, he was hosting 11 members of this group along with his 2 children at a resort he co-owned with his brother. On the day of the incident, the kids wanted to go on a trip to see a fish hatchery with the group. Alan was a bit reluctant at first to let them go, but ultimately caved in when members of the group assured him that they'd only visit the hatchery and come right back with the kids. However, for reasons that remain unclear, unbeknownst to Alan, the planned visit unexpectedly transformed into a 15-mile hike along the Big South Trail commencing at around 10 a.m. Taking 2 young kids on a lengthy hike without their father's permission, this was mistake number 1. The second, and arguably the worst mistake the group made, was that no one took explicit responsibility for the kids. Everyone just assumed that someone else was looking after Jared and Jocelyn, when in reality no one was. To make matters worse, the hikers had split into 2 groups, those walking faster and those lagging behind. This separation made it nearly impossible to keep track of the kids' whereabouts. About an hour and a half into the hike, Jared reportedly interacted with 2 fishermen before running off towards a group of hikers. Now, this is where things get a bit murky. From what I can gather, it's unclear whether he was somewhere between the 2 hiking groups or if he had already passed them entirely. The hikers seen by the fishermen might not have even been a part of the same group. Sadly, this was the point where Jared vanished. However, it wasn't until 12:15 p.m. that the Christian group realized that they hadn't seen him for over an hour. Panic set in, and some members of the group rushed back to the resort to inform Alan. He wasted no time, immediately driving frantically to the trail while beating his chest and saying, quote, "They lost my baby, they lost my baby." In the meantime, his resort manager filed a missing person report and got the rangers involved in the search. Since this was a fairly active hiking trail, the rangers in the area had plenty of experience finding missing people. So much so that the sheriff at the time stated, "Absolutely, I thought we would find him. Yes, it was a child, but my thought was we should be able to get in there with our people and do what we do and what we have done hundreds of times, find the person. It might take a few hours to find the child crying or hiding someplace nearby, but we would be done before midnight." He even instructed his subordinates to wake him up when they found Jared, but the news never came. After almost a full day of searching, Jared remained missing and the hopes of finding him alive began to wane. Things went from bad to worse when the helicopter that was searching for Jared stalled 100 feet in the air and crashed, injuring all 5 of its passengers. By October 7th, over 200 professional searchers, a dozen dog teams, professional trackers, a dive team, and a plane were doing everything they could to locate Jared, or at least find some clue that could answer his mysterious disappearance. Tragically, after 5 grueling days with no leads, the search for Jared came to a heartbreaking halt on the 8th of October. It became a massive story in the media and even led to the Colorado governor signing the Amber Alert plan into law. Jared's case, however, remained completely cold. That is, until June 4, 2003, when 2 hikers named Gary Watts and Rob Osborne found some tattered clothes and a sneaker about 500 feet above Jared's last known location. The pair already knew about his disappearance, so they instantly made the connection and contacted the authorities. What followed was a more thorough search of the area, and 10 days later, searchers made a grim discovery: a molar and a part of a human skull. DNA tests confirmed what Jared's family feared. These remains were his. They also confirmed that the clothing belonged to him, the same clothes Jared wore on the day he disappeared. After nearly 4 years of his disappearance, Jared's family finally had some closure. But even with these new discoveries, the question remains, what really happened to Jared? The most straightforward explanation is that he wandered off in the mountains, got lost, and eventually succumbed to hypothermia. But there's a problem with that theory. The spot where his clothes and remains were found is nearly inaccessible. It's extremely steep and rocky terrain that would be challenging for an adult to navigate, let alone a 3-year-old child. The most plausible theory is that he was attacked by a cougar. These animals are native to the area, and while they rarely attack humans, a small child could easily become a target. During the investigation, some of the hikers in the 11-member group also reported hearing a distant scream during that time, including Jared's sister Jocelyn. So, if the cougar theory is true, it would explain both the scream and how Jared's remains got so far from his last known position. And while it is pretty convincing, there are some inconsistencies in the animal attack premise that I find difficult to justify. For starters, researchers did not find any blood or cougar remains like hair on Jared's clothes. How can that be possible? What's even more puzzling is that Jared's pants were inside out when they were found in the forest. I can't think of any logical way a cougar, or any animal for that matter, could turn a pair of pants inside out. Not to mention the fact that the pair of sneakers they found were in excellent condition considering they would have gone through 4 winters in the Colorado mountains. All of this points to a far more disturbing theory, according to which Jared was actually abducted and later killed by another person. And the reason his sneakers were in such good shape was because the kidnapper likely scattered Jared's remains on the mountain years after the incident. I realize this is a horrifying thought, but it's really the only plausible explanation that accounts for all these strange details. Unfortunately, even with all the evidence we have, Jared's case remains as much of a mystery today as it was the day he disappeared. And the truth of what happened to him may never be known.
Anthony Donnellan went missing from his home in London in 1995 under strange circumstances. His case gathered little attention at the time, and almost 30 years later, his family are still pushing for answers. Anthony was better known as Tony to his friends. He grew up in Clare, Ireland, where he was the second youngest of 7 children. His parents owned a farm and expected their sons to carry on the family business, but Tony was always more interested in books and studying. When he was still a teenager, his personality suddenly changed. He started acting out, and his parents suspected he'd had an emotional break. He spent time in a mental hospital before going to London to stay with his sister for a year. Tony returned to Ireland to finish his education but moved back to London as an adult. Tony seemed happy with the life that he had made for himself in London. He was very outgoing and had a large number of friends, especially within the Irish community in the city. He also had come out as gay to his siblings. He worked as a bartender and had done some work on ships before. In 1995, Tony was living in an apartment in South London. He shared the apartment with his ex-boyfriend Peter, who owned the property, and Peter's new boyfriend. It was an unusual relationship, and Tony had spoken to his sister about changing the locks on his door, but there didn't appear to be any major problems. Only a few months before he disappeared, Tony had gotten into a bike accident. He was thrown from his bike and damaged his back. This meant that he was out of work as he couldn't lift heavy boxes or crates. His older sister invited him to stay with her for a while, but he refused. Tony's younger sister, Dolores, last saw him on October 7th, the Saturday before he vanished. They had a weekly trip to the cinema, and the trip went ahead without any issues. Dolores didn't notice anything out of the ordinary about her brother, and had no idea this was the last time she would see him. According to his apartment mates, the last time they saw Tony was on October 11th. He left the house while they were at work, and when they came back, Tony was nowhere to be found. They didn't think anything of it at the time. It wasn't unusual for Tony to spend a few days away with friends, but when he hadn't returned by October 14th, they reported him as a missing person. It was only after he was reported missing that Tony's family were told. His flatmates believed Tony disappeared by his own hand and was no longer alive, but his family couldn't believe that was the case. They also didn't think the police were taking his case seriously. His sisters wanted to see how he had left the room. He apparently left all of his belongings behind, and it looked as if he'd only gone out for a short trip. The only thing that was unusual was an envelope containing £1,000 addressed to Dolores. But when they arrived at the flat, they found Tony's belongings had already been packed into boxes and work was being done to his room to remove dry rot. The police interviewed Tony's flatmates but found no evidence that they were connected to Tony's disappearance. At some point in the investigation, 2 people were arrested, but later were released without charge. And since then, there's been no update on his case, and Tony remains missing. Anyone with information can contact the Missing People organization at 116-000.
Paulette Gabarra Farah. On the 21st of March 2010, the Gabarra family returned from a trip to their home in Mexico. That evening, the parents tucked their 2 daughters into bed, unaware it would be the last time they'd see one of them alive. The following morning, the family's nanny, Erica, entered 4-year-old Paulette Gabarra Farah's room to wake her, only to find the bed empty. She could not find the 4-year-old girl anywhere in her room. She turned everything upside down while searching for Paulette before finally alerting the mother of the kids, Lizette Farah. Lizette quickly informed the authorities, and they started investigating the little girl's disappearance almost immediately. However, this case was unlike anything they had seen before. Paulette had severe physical disabilities, so she couldn't have gone anywhere on her own. But the investigators didn't find any evidence of someone breaking into the house and kidnapping her either. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. So, after exhausting all of her options, the Attorney General's office quickly put together a poster explaining Paulette's situation and plastered it everywhere in the region. Lizette's sister, Arlette, also posted a few pictures on social media. Surprisingly, these social media posts went super viral, turning the disappearance of Paulette into a national headline. In the evening, Lizette even released a message on television to the potential abductors, asking them to return her daughter. She claimed that they could leave Paulette in a shopping center or some other crowded place and the family would not press any charges against them. Sadly, none of these efforts amounted to anything. That is until 9 days later on March 31st when the little girl's lifeless body was discovered back where it all began, her own room. It was stuck between the mattress and the foot of the bed. On the surface, this should have been the end of Paulette's case. However, the inconsistencies surrounding her disappearance were too significant to ignore. For starters, how is it possible that no one noticed the little girl's body just feet from where she was supposed to be asleep? The Gabara house was investigated by professionals who also used highly trained dogs. How could they miss something so obvious in their search? Most importantly, how did no one who visited her room notice the smell? As a comment on YouTube mentions, I found the body once. It was in a basement apartment and we went to do a checkup on her due to a smell complaint. Flies were everywhere and they were huge. The smell was thick and it stuck to everything. It was a hot and humid summer. She had been dead for 3 days. There is no way that Paulette was in that room for 9 days and no one noticed. The smell of death literally gets everywhere. Now, if the room was immediately taped off after Paulette's disappearance, all of this could have been potentially explained as nothing more than incompetence by the investigators. But in reality, the room had many visitors in the days after the incident, including guests who slept in that same bed for multiple nights. Lizette even gave an interview sitting on top of the bed where Paulette's body was later found. How did she not notice? The only logical explanation for all of these questions is that Paulette's body wasn't under the mattress during the initial searches. Instead, it was placed there later by someone, possibly one or both of her parents. According to the official coroner report, Paulette moved onto the bed on her own and fell headfirst into the gap between the mattress and the frame. There, she asphyxiated and passed away before her nanny Erica came looking for her in the morning. But the evidence contradicting this official statement is a bit overwhelming. For instance, when the rescuers found Paulette, she was wearing dark trousers with a pink giraffe pattern. However, Lizette clearly showed the same trousers just days earlier while showing Paulette's belongings during an interview.
No, esa es la pijama de mi grande. Okay. Ya ni quiero decir que tengo, pero no veamos. Sí, más vale, ¿verdad? Pero mejor miren la pijama ni la sacamos.
What's even more concerning is that during the official video where the authorities found the body, the investigators also uncover multiple bloodstains hidden in the sheets, some of which were the size of a soccer ball. At one point during the video, one of the investigators even remarks that they, referring to the parents, were beating up the kid. Despite this, the official report completely ruled out physical abuse and mysteriously made no mention of the bloodstains. When all this came out, it caused great outrage in Mexico, leading to Alberto Bazbaz resigning from his position as Attorney General of the state of Mexico. From what I've read on this incident, everything about this case suggests a cover-up by the authorities. It's possible one or both of the parents accidentally killed Paulette while attacking her and came up with an elaborate scheme to hide their crime while also farming media attention. And for this to work, someone high up must have been in on the scheme. Of course, all of this is merely conjecture on my part, as there's no evidence to prove any wrongdoing by either of the parents. Unfortunately, we'll likely never learn what happened to poor Paulette on that night. Unless, of course, someone with insider knowledge decides to come forward, though after 14 years, that seems increasingly unlikely. That being said, if the parents were the ones who caused this tragedy, they wouldn't be the first, because something very similar happened in this next case.
On the night of March 22nd, 2015, Dean Roche told his mother he was going to buy a car and he'd be back in half an hour. He never returned. The car was found crashed not far from where Dean had purchased it, but Dean himself was never found. Dean was 31 years old at the time of his disappearance, living in County Kilkenny with his mother, Geraldine. He spent the day spending time with his son, who lived with Dean's ex-partner. Geraldine didn't notice anything out of the ordinary that day. In the evening, he said he was going to purchase a car for £200, but he had over £900 cash with him at the time. He told Geraldine he'd only be gone for half an hour, and she had no reason to believe that wouldn't be the case. Dean had struggles in his life, but he'd never spent longer than a day away from home. He was especially close to his mother, so when he didn't come home that evening, she was worried. Geraldine contacted the police and tried to report Dean as a missing person the following morning, but the Garda dismissed her. Later, Geraldine approached an officer who was on patrol at a local park, who finally took her story seriously, and the search for Dean began. Dean had taken a taxi to pick up the car in a remote area, around 15 minutes from his mother's home. The taxi driver was contacted and informed that the trip was made. The seller was also contacted. He told authorities that Dean had seemed fine when they met. He spoke normally and appeared to be sober. But only a short distance from their meeting point, the car was located. The Mitsubishi Lancer had been crashed into a ditch and abandoned. This worried Dean's friends and family. They knew him to be a good driver and thought that the whole situation was strange. The police spoke to residents in the area where Dean's car was found, and one man came forward to say he'd spoken to an individual on the night Dean vanished. The man had been lingering outside the witness's house when he was spotted. He told the homeowner that he'd crashed his car and just wanted to let them know where it was. He said his brother was on the way to get him and he didn't need any help. If this individual was Dean, he was lying. Dean hadn't called his brother for help. In fact, phone records showed the only people he had called that night were the taxi driver and the seller he had met up with. Searches of the fields around the crash site didn't turn up any clues, other than a hat that Dean's family believed belonged to him. Dean's loved ones took matters into their own hands. When driving around the area, they spoke to a woman who lived nearby, and she said she'd seen Dean on the night that he went missing. He seemed disoriented and told her that he needed help. She'd gone inside to get her cell phone, but when she came back out, Dean was nowhere to be found. Shortly after, a large silver car drove past at high speed. The woman heard the car hit the brakes hard, and then she heard shouting. Someone was telling another person to get in the car. The woman had told the police this story, but they dismissed it. The authorities believed this was a red herring. Since then, there have been many rumors about what happened to Dean. And years later, a letter was sent to a local newspaper claiming Dean had been buried in a certain location. The writer was found and it turned out to be a hoax. Others have claimed that someone took Dean's life, but no evidence has ever been found. Anyone with information can contact the Kilkenny Garda station at 056-777-5000. Number 2. Missing person cases are never easy for family members. When a loved one goes missing in a foreign country, things become that much harder. But for the family of 22-year-old Paul Carter, that difficulty was only compounded by law enforcement agencies who didn't want to claim responsibility for the search. Paul has been missing for almost 18 years, with his family leading the investigation into his disappearance. Paul grew up in Erdington, England, with his mother and older sister, and he was very close to his family. Paul had a laboring job, working for a friend of his grandfather. The man's name was Mark, and he had a house in France. Paul, Mark, and the other people from work would often go on short vacations to France. It was something Paul enjoyed, and he'd never had a problem with the trips before. His April 2007 journey was different. According to news reports, this time the group were heading to France to help renovate a house. Before they left, Paul spoke to his mother. He told her he didn't want to go, but wouldn't say why. It seemed like he was hiding something, but his mother didn't realize it at the time. As the ticket had already been purchased, she encouraged him to go. She said she'd buy him a return ticket if he was unhappy. Paul and his friends drove to Portsmouth on April 21st, and there they boarded the overnight Brittany ferry bound for St. Malo. Mark never booked cabins for their trips. Normally, the men would find somewhere to sleep in one of the communal areas. Paul stayed up with a friend until around midnight. They were having drinks in the bar, and his friend went off with a barmaid. Paul told another person they were with that he was going to have a cigarette and then find somewhere to sleep, and it was the last time anybody saw him. The ferry docked at about 6 a.m., and Paul's friends expected him to meet back up with them. His passport and belongings were still in the car, and he shouldn't have been able to cross into France without them. But Paul didn't show up. At 11:30 a.m., Mark called Paul's family and told them what had happened. Unfortunately, the search for Paul had to be delayed. The ferry was already on its way back to England, but when it docked again that evening, a proper search took place. There was no sign of Paul on board. There was also no CCTV that could be accessed, making it impossible to determine where Paul went after he left the bar. Paul's family were in touch with the police in their home country in Portsmouth, but neither wanted responsibility for the case. Paul had boarded the ferry, so they considered it a matter for the French police. The French police were also unhelpful. Paul's family were not permitted to post missing person flyers around St. Malo. There was little publicity around the disappearance. Despite this, one witness did come forward not long after Paul's disappearance. The woman had been traveling on the ferry and told the police that she saw Park disembark in France. She recognized his tattoo and told the police he looked lost. Unfortunately, the police did not follow up on this sighting. The case went cold and has remained that way since. In 2020, Paul's family received some hope when a woman believed she had seen Paul living homeless in Slough. But searches in the area couldn't locate the missing man, and the trail went cold again. Anyone with information on the case is asked to contact the police on 101.
Lucy Meadows. On July 25, 1996, Jan Meadows visited the Rivergate Mall in Goodlettsville, Tennessee to sell some crafts at a flea market. After parking her car, she opened the back door to let her 3-year-old daughter Lucy out of the car. She then went to the passenger side of the car to retrieve some crafts she was going to sell. But when she came back around to the other side, her daughter was gone. She immediately contacted mall security and they conducted a thorough search of both the mall and the area surrounding it, but Lucy was nowhere to be found. Over several weeks following the incident, police dedicated hundreds of hours, interviewing 100 witnesses and relatives, following up on tips, speaking with parents of children resembling Lucy, and reviewing surveillance footage from the parking lot. Though the surveillance video was too distant to reveal any clues, it captured Jan Meadows wandering the lot, seemingly looking for someone. However, even after all this effort, they didn't find a single clue that could lead to Lucy's current whereabouts. But things were about to get much more disturbing when police started investigating Jan. For some context, Jan was a Korean immigrant who had separated from her husband Tom and was living with another Korean woman, Hyeon S. Dai, also known as Tammy. And in her original statement, Jan claimed that she had only looked away for a few seconds, and that was all it took for Lucy to disappear.
She said she opened the door and walked around to the trunk, and then the daughter disappeared.
But after a couple of weeks, she changed her story and said that she might have been busy for 10 to 15 minutes. This is a massive difference. As the lead investigator at the time pointed out, if they had known the time frame for the disappearance was 10 to 15 minutes instead of under a minute, they would have searched more extensively from the start. This sudden change in story also put Jan as a prime suspect in Lucy's disappearance. They put Jan under 2 polygraph tests and she failed both of them, after which she became reluctant to talk with the investigators. During this time, a neighbor also reported seeing the 3-year-old Lucy wandering outside early one March morning and not dressed for the weather and crying. Police also questioned her housemate Tammy, whose statement didn't fully align with Jan's story, making the whole situation even more suspicious. Police and the FBI then carried out an extensive search of the Meadows house, farm, and the surrounding area. However, they didn't find any evidence against Jan or Tammy, and the case was left wide open with no leads for the next 18 years. But then in November of 2004, a witness came forward. He claimed he saw Lucy lying on the floor at home wrapped in a blanket and looking like she could have been dead a day before her supposed disappearance. And while the police never released the name of this witness, I believe it was Daniel, Tammy's son, who would have been 11 years old at the time of the incident. If we take his testimony as truth, many of the inconsistencies in Lucy's case began unraveling. Lucy was likely already dead before her alleged disappearance on July 25th. Jan disposed of her body somewhere and then made up this abduction story to cleverly mask the truth. As for who killed Lucy, it could be Jan, it could be Tammy, or both. And the cause of her death could range from extreme neglect to overwhelming abuse. We have no way of knowing. And if Jan and Tammy have managed to hide the truth for over 28 years, it's unlikely they'll confess anytime soon. That said, the case is still open at the Goodlettsville Police Department. Who knows, maybe we'll see another witness come forward sometime in the future.
There was a window of less than an hour in which Christina Voltaire could have disappeared. This short time frame has only made her missing person case even more mysterious and confusing for investigators. Christina was a bright young woman living in Winter Haven, Florida at the time of her disappearance in 2011. She was born in Haiti and moved to Winter Haven with her father, Jean-Yves Voltaire, in 1999. Her father later moved to Palm Bay, but they remained close and regularly spoke on the phone. Christina wanted to work in the medical field and enrolled at Kaiser University, where she studied nuclear medicine. While studying, Christina became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl. But tragically, the baby passed away when she was about a year old in January of 2010. And it was around the anniversary of this tragedy when Christina went missing. She was last seen in public at an IHOP on January 8, 2011. While there, she started to feel unwell. Christina didn't have a cell phone at the time of her disappearance and had to borrow a friend's phone to cancel a hair appointment she had that day. She then went home to her apartment where she lived alone, intending to recover from her illness. At about 7 p.m., Christina received a visitor. It was Charles Pierre Giles, a friend who lived in the same apartment complex. His car had broken down a few blocks away, and he asked if he could borrow Christina's. He found her in her nightgown and robe drinking tea and working on her laptop. Christina gave him permission, and Charles took the keys and the car. He met a mechanic at his car to see what the damage was, then visited his mother, where they had dinner. It was less than an hour later when he returned to Christina's apartment. He found the door unlocked, which was strange. He'd locked the door when he left. There was no sign of Christina in the apartment, but her purse and other belongings were inside. He returned home, but checked in on the apartment throughout the night, hoping to return the car keys when Christina returned. The following morning, Christina still wasn't home, and Charles decided to report his friend as a missing person. The police took Christina's disappearance seriously from the beginning. Her apartment was processed, but there was no sign of a struggle or foul play. The way her robe had been left suggested she'd gotten dressed, and it seemed she left the apartment of her own free will. The police checked Charles's story, but the mechanic and Charles's mother were able to verify his whereabouts. The next person of interest was Charles's brother. He had been in an on and off relationship with Christina, but broke up with her when he found out the baby wasn't his. According to Christina's father, he could be jealous and aggressive, but he denied ever hurting her. He'd been out of town at the time of Christina's disappearance. ATM records and camera footage showed that he was taking money out in Miami at the time, so he couldn't have been responsible. Unfortunately, there were few clues to follow in Christina's case. She didn't have a phone or social media, so there was no trail for the police to follow. There was also no activity on her bank account. Christina's laptop was also examined, but she only used the device for schoolwork. It offered no clues as to what happened to her. Christina had plans to move to Palm Bay and transfer to the Kaiser University campus there. She was also planning to visit her mother in Haiti in the spring. The police believe she didn't run away to start a new life. Since her disappearance, there have been few tips, but the police regularly re-examine her case and appeal for information. Christina was 22 years old at the time of her disappearance. She's described as 5'2" and 120 pounds with black hair, brown eyes, and a C-section scar on her abdomen. Anyone with information can contact the Winter Haven Police Department at 863-291-5858. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.
Sabrina Eisenberg.
Sabrina, come crawl to mommy. Come here. Come here, gorgeous.
This is the first video Florida couple Steve and Marlene Eisenberg recorded of their nearly 5-month-old daughter, Sabrina. What they didn't know at the time was that this was also going to be the last. A day after this video, on the 23rd of November 1997, the couple watched a Disney movie with their 3 kids and tucked them into bed. Marlene later checked up on her daughter around midnight before going to sleep. But when she woke up the next morning, she was greeted with a tremendously frightening sight.
And as I turn around and I look and notice my laundry room door out to my garage is opened. And then as I get closer, I'm looking now out to the street and seeing that my garage door is up. So now I'm just looking straight out to the street.
She immediately rushed to Sabrina's bedroom, which was the closest to the garage. Unfortunately, it was already too late.
I ran into the first bedroom, which is Sabrina's room, and I look in the crib and Sabrina's gone. And I scream.
This shook Marlene to her core, which is quite apparent from her disturbing 911 call.
911. Hello. I need to believe my baby's been kidnapped. Alright, ma'am, need to calm down. Okay. Alright, take a deep breath. What's your baby's been kidnapped? I just got to wake my son up. My garage door was wide open. My house to my door was wide open, and my baby's gone out of the crib. How old is your baby? My baby is 5 months old. Oh God, help me.
Upon closer inspection, the couple found out that Sabrina's disappearance was partially their own fault. They had forgotten to close the garage door the night before. As the police got involved, they started a manhunt for the supposed kidnapper, which ended up being the largest manhunt in Florida history at the time. Investigation of Sabrina's room revealed a mysterious footprint and some unidentified fingerprints near her crib. Now, this should have been the proof that someone had already kidnapped little Sabrina. However, cops were struggling to find any other lead or evidence that could lead them to the perpetrator. So, instead of continuing their search outward, they shifted their focus inward, turning their attention to Steve and Marlene.
The idea that someone could have walked into a suburban home in the middle of the night, plucked a 5-month-old child out of her crib, obviously raised a lot of suspicion around the Eisenbergs.
It's unusual for a true kidnapping. A lot of times they find out that it's someone the family knew or had knowledge of, and that's part of the leads we're looking at.
Sabrina's parents were now lead suspects in the case of their own missing daughter. They were summoned for extensive interviews on multiple occasions and were also instructed to take polygraph tests. And while Steve passed his tests, the results for Marlene's tests came out inconclusive due to the stress she was under. It seemed like the higher-ups had already made up their mind about Steve and Marlene being the perpetrators, and were just trying to find any evidence that could support this conclusion. At one point, they even instructed Marlene to appear cold and uncaring on TV, and then used that to question the legitimacy of her feelings for her daughter.
Please bring our baby back to us. She needs her mother and her father, and we all miss her and love her very much, and we need her to come home to us, please.
It backfired because the perception was that they were cold.
Marlene was seen by some as being not authentic, unemotional. Law enforcement seemed to focus in on that display.
It took all the strength that I had to say what I said, and then the minute I was done, I broke down in tears. Okay, hysterical. But of course the cameras were not put on me then.
It got to the point where Steve and Marlene were no longer interested in talking to the police and hired an attorney to act as a shield. However, this only made things worse for the Eisenbergs, because on December 12, 1997, law enforcement successfully received the court's permission to install hidden listening devices in their home. These devices remained active for almost 3 months and captured over 2,600 conversations between the couple. Police then used these recordings to build a case against Steve and Marlene, claiming that they had found evidence of the couple admitting to Sabrina's murder. These alleged transcripts included statements like, on December 23, 1997, Marlene said to Steve, "The baby's dead and buried. It was found dead because you did it. The baby's dead. No matter what you say, you just did it." To which Steve responded by saying, "Honey, there was nothing I could do about it. We need to discuss the way that we can beat the charge. I will never break from the family pact and our story, even if the police were to hold me down. We will do what we have to do." On January 21, 1998, Steve said, "I wish I hadn't harmed her. It was the cocaine." And 10 more counts of similar incriminating statements. They also used these as evidence to break into the Eisenbergs' home and arrest the couple. However, when the cops presented this evidence in court, the judge was unable to make out the phrases that were claimed to have been said. The entire case was dismissed, and Steve and Marlene even won a counter lawsuit which made the government pay their attorney fees for the bogus lawsuit. And from my research, I'm fairly confident that Steve and Marlene were likely not the reason behind their daughter's disappearance. One of their old neighbors also came to their defense in a YouTube comment which read, "I lived about a half-mile from the Eisenbergs at the time of this tragedy. We also had a 6-month-old baby boy at the time. I never so quickly moved my son's crib into our master bedroom for a month or so after that happening. Personally, after hearing so very much about the case, and I actually knew someone who knew the mom, these folks could not have done it. They were genuinely wonderful parents and a decent, normal family. My heart goes out to these people to this day. Our son is 25 now. Sabrina would be 25 years old this June. So sad." Sadly, while the police focused on blaming Steve and Marlene, the real perpetrator continued to slip further from their grasp. Now, it's been over 27 years since Sabrina disappeared. It's unclear if she's even alive or if she met an untimely death. The Eisenberg couple, however, has not given up hope.